Hello and welcome to helpyourmath.com. In this video, we are going to talk about the process of a statistical study as well as various sampling techniques. In the previous video, we talked about the Nielsen Rating and how they come up with those numbers of viewers for programming each week. So they said that last week 22 million viewers watched The Big Bang Theory. How did they come up with that? Well, of the 5,000 households that they monitor, 7% tuned into The Big Bang Theory, and they feel that their 5,000 cases are representative of Americans as a whole. So they said, well, that we're going to project that 7% of the American population watched The Big Bang Theory, and it turns out that 7% of just over 300 million is 22 million. So that's how they conduct their statistics. Let's talk about the process that they use and that we generally use for a statistical study. The 5 steps are listed here. So step 1, state the goal of your study. What are you trying to figure out here? Or what are you trying to show? Step 2, choose a representative sample from the population sample. And we are going to talk about how we do step 2 in just a little bit. Step 3, collect raw data from the sample and summarize these data by finding sample statistics of interest. So what are we interested in finding? Are we interested in what the teens were watching? Are we interested, so by age group or by gender? What are we trying to look at here? Step 4, use the sample statistics to infer the population parameters. So if you think that your method of sampling was legitimate, then we might be able to infer population parameters based on what this study found. And step 5, draw conclusions. Determine what you learned and whether or not you achieved your goal. We're going to look at this again as a diagram. So step 1, we're going to start and we're going to identify the goals. Next, we need to figure out what is the population. Is the population all Americans? Is it all urban Americans, all Americans who live in suburbs? What are we trying to do here? Maybe it's not people. Maybe we're looking at cats, or maybe we're just looking at tabby cats. So that's what you have to figure out. What is going to be the population based on what the goals are of what you're trying to achieve. Once you've figured out the population, now we need to draw from the population. We need to figure out what the sample will be. And again, we're going to talk about how we pick samples in just a little bit. Then we need to collect raw data and summarize it. So we need to get that raw data and summarize it. That's going to provide us these sample statistics. So then we're going to say, okay, well, based on this sample, this is what I learned. We're going to make inferences based on what we found, and we are going to project them as population parameters. And then we're going to draw conclusions. And one thing about a good study is that it can be replicated. So that's kind of like the gold star of these studies is if I do this study and I come up with a certain conclusion, and then Bob over in California does this study, does he come up with a similar conclusion? Because that's how we identify when a study is good versus when it's maybe not as good. Let's look at an example of identifying the 5 key components to a statistical study. Each month, the U.S. Labor Department surveys 60,000 households to determine characteristics of the U.S. workforce. One population parameter of interest is the U.S. unemployment rate, defined as the percentage of people who are unemployed among all those who are either employed or actively seeking employment. Describe the 5 basic steps of a statistical study and how they apply to this research. So this is something we hear about all the time, right? Especially lately, we hear about the unemployment rate, whether it's going up or down, and certain things that go into creating the unemployment rate. So now we know one way that they gather information on this is they look at 60,000 households. Okay, so what is step 1? Step 1 is identifying the goals. The goal of this research is to learn about the unemployment within the American population workforce or those actively seeking employment, right? So that's what they're interested in. We're looking at of interest is the U.S. unemployment rate. So that kind of tells us, okay, here's the goal of what we're looking at in this study. Step 2, we want to draw from the population. The Labor Department chooses a sample of 60,000 households consisting of people who are employed or actively seeking employment. So in this case, the population is going to be the U.S. workforce or those who are currently seeking employment. Next, we need to collect and summarize the data. So the U.S. Labor Department asks questions to people in the sample. And where was the sample? Right here, 60,000 households. And their responses are the raw data for the research. Then the department interprets these data into the sample statistics. Step 4, we make inferences. Based on the sample statistics, the Labor Department makes estimates of the population parameters. And step 5, we then draw conclusions, or the Labor Department does anyway. So the Labor Department will draw conclusions based upon the population parameters and other information. So that's when we hear the unemployment rate is 9% or the unemployment rate is going up or down. It's based on these 60,000 households. Okay, so how did the U.S. Labor Department choose these 60,000 households? Wow, how did the Nielsen Rating system choose their 5,000 households? That's what we're going to talk about now. Not necessarily those, but we are going to talk about the different ways that we can choose a sample. Choosing a sample is super important. A reliable study will use a sample that fairly represents the population as a whole. So if we are trying to conduct research about all Americans, it probably wouldn't be very accurate if I only took a sample of people living in New York City, because New York City is not representative of the entire United States. If this can be done, then it is reasonable to make inferences from the sample to the population. However, if it cannot be done, then it is unlikely to draw any conclusions that will be accurate about the population. And another example of something that would not be representative, if you want to determine the average height and weight of male students at a large university, and you choose to measure the heights and weights of a sample of members from the football team, this probably is not going to produce accurate information. Football players tend to be bulky, they tend to be taller, and it's going to very much skew the data that we obtain. Instead, what we might do is let a computer program randomly select 100 male students. This is undoubtedly going to provide more reliable data. So this is one thing we could do, is randomly select. Another thing we could do is not randomly select by choosing the football team, but again, your sample is probably not going to be super representative. Let's talk about a definition. And I keep using this, so it's good we're defining it now. A representative sample is a sample in which the relevant characteristics of the sample members are generally the same as those of the entire population. And again, any sample is going to have flaws. It's never going to be 100% accurate. We're just trying to do the best we can to come up with the greatest representation of the whole population, especially when you can't actually question every single person or every single thing in the population. One of the best ways to do this is by what's called a simple random sampling, where each sample of the population has an equal chance of being selected. So if I want to choose 100 male students at this university, all groups of 100 males have the same chance of being selected. While simple random sampling is a great way to choose a representative sample, it is not always practical or necessary or possible. Here are some of the common sampling techniques. There's the one we just talked about, the simple random sampling. This is where we choose a sample of items in such a way that every sample of the same size has an equal chance of being selected. So we see this. We might use a program to kind of generate a list. There's some good websites. If you do need to do this, I do this in my classroom. If I'm coming up with groups for things, I will choose random samples based on the computer algorithm. Okay, another common technique is systematic sampling. This is where we use a simple system to choose the sample, such as selecting every 10th member of the population. I remember in the early aughts when you were flying on airplanes, that's what TSA would do. They would pluck every 5th person who was boarding a flight and check them and go through all their stuff. And somehow I always ended up being that 5th person. It was crazy. But that's systematic sampling. They select every kth member, so whether it's every 10th, every 5th, every 100th, that's systematic. There's also convenience sampling. We choose a sample that is convenient to select, such as people who happen to be in the same classroom. Convenience sampling is one of the most common because it's usually what we are able to get information from. So in this particular example, you can see somebody's just yelling out their window, hey, do you support the death penalty? And that's how they're choosing to do their convenience sampling, from the comfort of their own window. And the last technique is stratified sampling. When we do this, we are concerned about differences among subgroups or strata within the population. We first identify the subgroups and then draw a simple random sample from within each subgroup. The total samples consist of all the samples from the individual subgroups. So we might say, okay, I'm going to lump together anyone who's younger than 20. I'm going to lump together all the 20 people in their 20s, all the people in their 30s, all the people in their 40s. And then from each group, you pluck 10 of them. You randomly choose 10 of them. That's stratified sampling. So you can see here, looks like they broke it up by gender. So they're going to say, okay, I'm going to select 2 women and 2 men. And that way I can kind of, have these little subgroups so I know each grouping is included. Okay, we're going to look at some examples now, and I want you to tell me what type of sampling is used and if it's likely to be representative of the population. So A, you are conducting a survey of students in a dormitory. You choose your sampling by knocking on the door of every 10th room. Okay, so what sampling is this? I didn't hear you. Can you say it again? That's right. This is systematic sampling. This sample could be representative, assuming students were randomly assigned to rooms. But if you, again, this could be very biased, because what if you're in the dorm that has all the athletes? Then you're likely not going to get a representative sample because you're taking just a select subgroup of the students. So you want to make sure that you're in a dorm that includes all different types of students within that university. How about this one? To survey opinions on a possible property tax increase, a research firm randomly draws the addresses, of 150 homeowners from a public list of all homeowners. So what did they do here? They did the simple random sample, and this is very likely to be representative of the population. The population here is all homeowners, so pulling a list where it would randomly choose 150, that's a great way to do this. In our next example, agricultural inspectors for Jefferson County checked the levels of residue from 3 common pesticides on 25 ears of corn from each of the 104 corn-producing farms in the county. Which one is this? Say it with me. This is stratified sampling. So here they chose to use a subgroup from each farm, and as long as they chose randomly which 25 ears they select, then it should be pretty representative, right? If they just chose the first 25 they saw, probably not great. But if they went around and chose 25 random ones, that should be good to go. So this is a subgroup or strata of the population. As long as the ears of corn are collected randomly on each farm, each set of 25 is likely to be representative of its farm. In our last example, anthropologists determined the average brain size of early Neanderthals in Europe by studying skulls found at 3 sites in southern Europe. So what kind of sampling was used here? Well, we would say that this is convenience sampling, but really it's like this is the only option they had. And it seems reasonable to assume that these skulls are representative because we have no other information. So we have to say, this is the best we have. We hope that all the other brains were like this. These have been examples of the statistical process and different types of sampling methods we use. Thank you for stopping by.